So once again, we're here in beautiful Austin, Texas. I think it's like 90 degrees outside about, let's say.
Winter.
But it's really pretty. I gotta tell you, I mean, I've been coming to Austin for a long time and I really enjoy it. And it's not just because of the many bars. So now we have Rick Hawkins. And Rick, you're gonna introduce your whole group, correct?
That's right.
Fantastic. And why don't you introduce your group, talk about your innovation and growth hormone deficiency treatment, and we'll go from there. So ready? Yeah, let's get started. Thanks.
Yeah, and Lisa, do you have a presentation that everybody can see?
Yes, it's up on the screen.
Can everyone there see this?
I see it right now. It looks real good.
Okay, thank you, Marty.
Is it on a slideshow or?
It's a slideshow. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And Marty and Ivy Family Office Network appreciate the invitation for us to talk to you today. If you go to the next slide, you know, we're a public company traded on NASDAQ under LUMO. We're based in Austin, Texas, and Ames, Iowa. This is a standard forward-looking statement that we always have to have. But the space we're in is in the rare disease space, and we have a lot of experience, and we're going to tell you a little bit about that. So essentially, we have a lead compound that could be quite disruptive in the market. The market is quite large, it's over $1 billion, and the first indication we're going for is growth hormone deficiency in children or PGHD. And we have a phase 2B study that's going to start before the end of the year. Cash on hand at the end of the first quarter was $85.8 million. But I'm happy to announce that as of, we just announced yesterday that we sold what's called a priority review voucher from another compound that we worked on, the Ebola vaccine that we partnered with Merck. We just sold that for $100 million and we got 60% of the proceeds, or $60 million, all non-dilutive money that went directly into our treasury, or that will very, very soon. Big event for us yesterday. With us today is our Chief Medical Officer, Gene Kennedy. John McHugh is our COO and Chief Scientific Officer. I might add that John, in terms of rare disease, he's the scientific founder of two major divisions of the NIH that had to do with the development of rare disease assets. My background, 10 years at J&J doing preclinical, clinical drug development. Before I started one of the very first CROs, so I was a pioneer in that sector, but I also pioneer in the manufacturing sector, was one of the very first recombinant protein manufacturing facilities that was built. I've been in drugs, diagnostics, and devices, serial entrepreneur. I'm the founder of Lumos, and we are well on our way to, I believe, disrupting a well-established market. So let me go into that a little bit with you with the next slide. We have a base therapeutic that is that can go a lot of different directions. We're starting with pediatric growth hormone deficiency. That study is going to start before the end of the year, but we believe that we can have an effect on almost a dozen different rare diseases of growth hormone deficiency. And as soon as we get a little bit of experience under our belts with PGHD, we're going to probably Turner syndrome and children born small for gestational age. But in addition to that, we just got a transforming event yesterday in the fact that we sold this PRV for $60 million in cash, and that gives us some flexibility to go out and look for other assets. And because of our decades of experience in the rare disease space, we believe that we're well on the way of doing that. If we go to the next slide. Now, PGHD alone is over $1 billion market, largest one in the US. It's growing at a nice pace, and that's not counting China. But overall, the recombinant growth hormone, injectable growth hormone market is well over $3 billion. If you go to the next slide. So in this indication, we're going for children who are do not grow. In other words, their pituitary glands don't produce enough growth hormone. Therefore, their height velocities are far below. The standard of care is a daily injectable, usually about 2,500 of them in the lifetime of a child, starting typically at age 7, going through puberty. And to say the least, this is not an ideal situation for kids. And if you go to the next slide, one of the biggest problems is, as a result, is compliance. And this is notoriously poor adherence in this patient population. You can imagine a little kid who's going for a overnight stay with friends who doesn't want to take shots, or summer camp, or long trips with families, or whatever it might be. And in fact, it's been reported that if you miss about 2 doses a week, then you can lose up to 50% of your height velocity, your potential height velocity. We believe we're going to be disruptive in the market in the fact that we have a once a day oral growth hormone secretagogue. It is not a growth hormone, an oral growth hormone product, but it's a secretagogue, and our Chief Scientific Officer is going to go into a little bit more detail with that, starting with this next slide. John McHugh, go ahead.
Hey, Rick, I just want to talk for 1 second here. Can you talk a little bit about the market, or you're going to get to that as well, like the size of the market and the pricing and who pays for it?
Yeah, well, we can talk about it really quickly. Once again, growth hormone market in the U.S. is about $1.1 billion in U.S., Europe, and Japan. 65% of that is in the U.S. The average reimbursement for recombinant growth hormone is over $30,000 per patient per year. And once again, it's growing nicely, and that's just in PGHD, not counting the other growth hormone deficient diagnoses, which is over $3 billion a year, not counting China.
So there's 30,000 plus a year reimbursed.
That's right. That's
okay,
right.
Great.
All right.
And my last question, at least on this topic, is: aren't there other uses of growth hormone outside of pediatric needs?
Yes, there are. I mean,
among adults.
Yeah, well, as I said, there's almost a dozen different growth hormone deficient diagnoses, and once again, and you'll understand, our drug will address, we believe, most of those, and we'll go into the details of that next with John in his presentation.
Thank you, Rick. We'll dive into the mechanism of action of this therapeutic. So as Rick said, our molecule is not an oral version of a recombinant growth hormone or protein. It's a small molecule that you can take orally, and when it gets into circulation, it binds to a receptor in your pituitary, your anterior pituitary, and by binding, it causes the pituitary to do what it wants to do, which is to release growth hormone. And growth hormone is released normally in the average person as pulses across the day, somewhere between 23 and 25 pulses. And what our molecule does is it increases the amplitude of each one of those peaks, but it doesn't really change, the nature of how it gets released. So by increasing the amplitude of each one of those peaks over 24 hours, you increase the amount of growth hormone that's circulating. And that in turn causes your liver to make IGF-1, and IGF-1 and growth hormone both act on they both act on the growth plates and the long bones in these kids and cause these kids to grow. What's an interesting part of how we're intervening therapeutically, which means our molecule targets above the release of growth hormone, is that we can take advantage of the natural feedback mechanisms that exist to slow down the production of growth hormone. So if we stimulate too much growth hormone, the body is tuned to modulate the amounts of both IGF-1 and growth hormone. And that's a real distinct difference between the recombinant human growth hormone therapy that's there today, which is a single bolus dose that goes away after 6 hours because of PK. As well, it's a unique difference between the long-acting drugs that are also being developed, which might shift the standard of care from daily dosing to weekly dosing. So with that, let's go to the next slide, Lisa. So on this slide, one of the consequences of our molecule's mechanism of action is that there are some kids who may not respond to it. And this is because the diagnosis of pediatric growth hormone deficiency comes from a lot of different causes. Some kids simply can't make enough growth hormone to grow at the same rate as their peers, but they can make some. And those are the kids who are going to respond to our therapeutic. There are other kids who might have a defect that prevents them from synthesizing growth hormone or storing it in a vesicle so that when we try to stimulate its release, they can't do that. And those kids are not going to respond to our drug. And what we had to do to really make this a reality to develop this drug is figure out a way to separate those two groups of kids with the same diagnosis. So we came up with a series of tests. It's two simple tests actually that enable us to, before the child is treated, determine whether we think they're going to respond to the drug or not. So we believe that 50 to 60% of the patients who are diagnosed with pediatric growth hormone deficiency will be able to respond to this therapeutic. So I'm going to go to the next slide and talk to you about some of the clinical data that's around. As you all know, the pathway to develop a drug can be long and arduous. The thing that is remarkable about this molecule is that we licensed it from Merck. Merck spent a number of years working on this molecule for different indications. And so they've already given this molecule to 1,000 patients, 1,000 adults, and tested it in lots of different indications that they were interested in. So they were mostly interested in large patient population diseases, things like Alzheimer's or recovery from hip fracture, or sarcopenia is what they originally tried, which is kind of muscle wasting in the elderly. And Merck wasn't satisfied with the results of those trials. They did do a couple of trials in the area that we're interested in pediatric growth hormone deficiency. And that data, they did 3 trials, and they enrolled about 200 kids in these 3 trials, and they actually dosed 150 kids with the therapeutic. And what we're going to focus on today is what would be the key study right now, which is a study that focuses on kids who have never been treated with a therapeutic yet, so newly diagnosed, what we would call naive to treatment. And Merck generated a lot of data in that study that we can use to validate our assays to select kids who are responsive, and that's what I'm going to show you about on the next slide. So this is a set of data that, as I said, Merck generated. So this is bringing in kids who are diagnosed with pediatric growth hormone deficiency and treating them with either a placebo, a control arm of the standard of care, recombinant human growth hormone, or 0.4 or 0.8 mg per kg per day of our therapeutic. And the outcome is a really nice thing to measure. It's annualized height velocity. And so you can measure height in a stadiometer out to 4 significant digits. So it's a very precise measurement. So if you look at the all subjects graph, which is the graph on the left, you'll see something a little disconcerting. And that is at the highest dose of the drug, LUM-201, at 0.8 mg per kg, those kids are not growing at the same rate as the kids who are given the standard of care. And this is the data that Merck looked at when they ran this study. We went back and re-examined this data because we felt that there were a number of kids who came into this trial who weren't able to respond to the drug. So I mentioned that a couple of slides ago, that some kids can respond, some can't. And we developed kind of an algorithm or a cutoff that helps us separate the responders from the non-responders. And we applied it to this previously generated clinical data. So if you look to the graph on the right and look at the PEM positive graph, so here we filtered out, using the cutoffs that we determined, the people we don't think can respond. And what's left is a group of patients who grow essentially equally between the 0.8 mg per kg group and the recombinant human growth hormone group. So they're not statistically different just using a simple t-test, which means that they can't be considered different. They're therefore the same. If you look at the kids that we took out of the analysis because we don't think they can respond to our drug, you see a very different thing. You see a dramatic difference between how much those kids grew on recombinant human growth hormone and how much they grew on our therapeutic. And that makes sense because the kids that we're taking out of this analysis are the kids who grow, who are the most growth hormone deficient. And those kids tend to have very, very fast catch-up growth on recombinant human growth hormone, but they also tend to not respond at all to a secretagogue because of the nature of their, of the reason that they are diagnosed with PGHD.
Hey, John, do you have a breakdown of like the percent of each case? Like what percent responded to your treatment, what percent did not?
Yeah, so it's about the number that I quoted before, about 50 to 60% out of the entire diagnosed PGHD population. So this is just a snapshot, right? This is one trial.
Got it. Yep.
But we believe doing some calculations that it's about 50 to 60%. The other important thing to note on this slide is that the difference between 0.4 and 0.8 mg per kg, those two growth bars, again, are not the same, so they're different, which tells us that at higher doses of the drug, we're seeing more growth. And so that sets us up for thinking about how to go forward in a trial that we're going to run using these cutoffs. And that's to suggest to us that if we go to higher doses, we'll be able to achieve higher growth. So the next slide is a little bit of data to back up that assumption. So as you give more of your therapeutic, LUM-201, you'd like to see higher circulating levels. So you'd like to see dose responsive exposure, and that's what the graph on the left shows. The graph on the right demonstrates something called a pharmacodynamic response. So what we're doing is we're giving our therapeutic and we're looking at its mechanism of action. We're looking at it, we're looking to see how much growth hormone people can release when we stimulate them with higher doses of LUM-201. And what's very interesting here is as you go up from 1 mg in an adult all the way up to 200 mgs in an adult, you get an increasing amount of growth hormone that's released. One thing to note is that the 100 and 200 mg doses give you the same amount of growth hormone. So that means, as I talked about earlier, that we've added enough growth hormone, we've added enough LUM-201 or the secretagogue that we activate some of the feedback mechanisms and slow down the production of growth hormone. The important thing to take away from this slide is that the highest dose tested in the study that Merck ran is represented by the light blue line. About 25 mgs of an adult equals about 0.7 mgs per kg exposure in a kid. And the window that we have to increase the amount of growth hormone, or the effector for growth, is really from 25 all the way up to 100. And so that we're taking advantage of that information and planning to use higher doses in the trial that we're going to run that will enable us to generate higher doses of growth hormone, which should lead to higher growth. If there are no questions, I'm gonna turn it over to Gene Kennedy, who's gonna talk you through our clinical plan.
I have one question that was more business oriented. I'm not sure if it's Rich is the person to answer it or not, but just to get back to the question of reimbursement, how is that covered by regular insurance, or is that covered by Medicare, or where does the reimbursement come from?
Gene, you know how to answer that question.
Yeah, so it's a combination. I mean, you can talk a lot about the U.S. healthcare system, but greater than 95, 96% of kids in the United States are covered by either private or public insurance, and they all reimburse for this indication.
Great. That's all I wanted to know, because as you know, the biggest investor question is who pays and when, right? So perfect.
Yep. The CHIP program and such are different from some of the other programs. They're usually relatively well funded. So on to clinical trials. Thanks, John. We believe we're one trial away from doing a registration trial that shows this drug has the potential to show this drug is efficacious. So we believe one trial will link the data that John just showed you to that trial. And we have two goals for this phase 2B trial. We want to confirm the strategy that John just laid out, this PEM strategy. We believe by selecting kids who are likely to respond to this drug, we can more easily show that it works for those kids and do a much more focused development program. Secondly, as John said, we believe there is potentially more efficacy that is untapped at higher doses of this drug. And by going to higher doses, we believe we can show that this drug is equivalent to the current standard of care when given to the right kids. So this will be an 80-patient study. There'll be 3 doses of our LUM-201 drug, 0.8 milligrams per kilogram, which is the dose that was used at the highest level in the previous studies. And then we're going to go to 1.6 milligrams and 3.2 milligrams, which covers that whole range that John just showed you on the previous slide. Now, in this trial, we will also include a control arm of injectable growth hormone because we think it's important to have a contemporaneous control arm that really shows how we're doing against the standard of care. This will be an 80-patient study. There'll be 20 kids roughly in each of these 4 arms. These will be kids that have not been treated before. It's the best place to start because, as John said, they catch up in that first year of growth. And when they're doing that catch-up growth, you can really show how well you're working. We're going to treat them for 6 months and then double how much they grow in the first 6 months for our outcome measure. And we're going to have this trial up and running by the end of 2020. Any questions?
Again, I'm getting back to financials. How much have you guys raised so far to get to this stage? And how much are you raising to get through this stage?
Okay, so we're really in a fortunate position.